I want to share some thoughts on where we're at in the territory and what I believe we must do to move forward. I will focus my address on the question of what it means to be seated here in this House and what it means to be a Northern. Given this is a budget address, I want to begin by talking about a quarter. Not $250,000, a 25-cent piece. Mr. Speaker, when you look at a quarter, what do you find? On one side, you see an aging monarch who lives thousands of miles from here. On the other side, you see a caribou, an animal whose future becomes more and more precarious each year. How do we in this House self-locate, even as our currency seems to simultaneously represent, overlook, and mock our interests? The contrast is emblematic of the position we are in today. Constituents of one of the wealthiest nations on earth, yet we govern a territory too often forgotten and left to deal with economic and social crises threatening a way of life. Mr. Speaker, the grand bargain of Northern participation in the Confederation that was Canada would be that people would have a standard of living found anywhere else in Canada. Mr. Speaker, that bargain has failed. Our climate, our economy, our education, our housing, even our actual caribou are in crisis, Mr. Speaker. And the Government of Canada remains similar to a monarch, too slow to invest in the transformational change this territory needs, even as tens of thousands of Canadians struggle too far out of sight for outsiders to understand. Mr. Speaker, this is not a new story. For decades, we've seen investments in the grand bargain for Arctic sovereignty fall off. Our communities remain disconnected, lacking physical and digital infrastructure most Canadians have taken for granted for years. Our people struggle with staggering rates of mental illness and intergenerational trauma, and our most vulnerable often face these struggles without roofs over their heads, and we face one of the greatest housing shortages in the developed world. Mr. Speaker, these aren't problems that we can solve with the transfer payments that trickle in each year. And in fact, that's not what they were ever designed to solve. To tackle the big issues of the day, we need transformative investment, the sustained, multi-billion-dollar kind which our tiny tax base could never expect to afford as we pay our bills. And with the fresh scars of colonialism affecting generations of the Indigenous people in this territory, exasperating every issue, I believe it is a moral imperative for Ottawa to put that kind of money behind making it right and putting the North on even footing with the rest of Canada. But Mr. Speaker, I have to say, I don't place all the blame on the federal government for not opening their wallets. Part of the blame lies with us, with successive governments who didn't articulate a clear enough vision of who we are as a territory.
Mr. Speaker.
We negotiated devolution, and yet for 6 years we've hit the wall in fulfilling its true vision of further devolving powers to Indigenous governments. We've released strategies to renew children in care and to deal with our education crisis, and then the federal government via the Auditor General. Too many children fall through the cracks and inflate our graduation rates. And most recently, we've answered a housing crisis by failing to put 42 inexpensive units at risk because we couldn't get our ducks in a row. So how do we get beyond the narrative of stasis, Mr. Speaker? We need to tell our story, Mr. Speaker. We need to present a vision for what this territory can be, and we need to back it up. So what's the biggest story I believe we can lead in this assembly? Mr. Speaker, it's reconciliation. And as blockades line the tracks across our nation, we in the North have a chance to show our country how to bring people together and break down the barriers dividing us. We've already come a long way compared to our peers. We've settled a lot of big land claims, and as those claims were settled, we saw the potential of our Indigenous governments unleashed. The Nuviala Regional Corporation is paving the way with hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. Communities like Delaney are finally self-governing, setting their own path forward for the future. The Gwich'in jumped us by 7 years for an electronic voting. The Clecho are world leaders in mine logistics, Mr. Speaker. I could go on, but we all know we have so much more to do. We need to settle the Acacho and Decho claims. For too long, we've seen too many stories of how our government is standing in the way. It's self-defeating, Mr. Speaker. The vision after devolution was to get our house in order and continue to devolve powers and resources to Indigenous governments across this territory. The vision was to realize a Denendeh and a Nuvialuit where public and Indigenous governments interacted nation to nation. And it's not just about finishing this long, painful process. It's about untying our hands and embracing the economic opportunities settling these questions would bring. Acacho believes there's $1 billion on the table when their process ends. The Datro is a home to unbelievable sites and minerals. We need to get UNDRIP on the books during this assembly. After a century of damage, we need to show we're ready to make the next step in decades of healing. For the people who've lived in this land for thousands of years, their relationship with Canada has been devastating, more often than it has been beneficial. We in Canada have much work to do in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and reconciling what our identity is as a whole. Mr. Speaker, I want to emphasize that I am a patriot, a word not often used by people of my generation. And I may not sound it at times, but I am in fact strongly committed to this venture that we call Canada. Something very understandably many Indigenous people are not as committed to. Mr. Speaker, that is understandable, and if I were Dene, I am sure I would have few nice things to say about our federal government. As a Canadian, it is my role to acknowledge our history and our present. In the face of this reality, I am not here to give up or feel guilty. I am here to take some responsibility and amend the wrongs. This is what reconciliation truly is. It is about hope for this nation and hope for the people of the North. It is not a hollow buzzword, but a reshaping of Canadian identity. Mr. Speaker, right now, all across this country, you can hear young Indigenous people on the steps of their legislature yelling, "Reconciliation is dead." This is because people in power failed to acknowledge our history and in turn failed their people. Mr. Speaker, you will hear me speak over the next 4 years about colonialism. I say this not for shock value, but it is the reality at the heart of Northern identity. The history of Canada is one of colonialism by definition. Canada was a colony of Great Britain, and in turn the French colonists were conquered by the British colonists. This land we are now in was given to some man named Rupert, who is even less relevant to that monarch on our money. And in turn, that land was given to the Hudson's Bay Company, and finally, what is left is the Northwest Territories, a territory that was carved off and is only northwest in its relationship to Ottawa. From where I stand, Mr. Speaker, it is exactly where it needs to be. Mr. Speaker, the introduction of resource extraction from the north with profits sent to other territories took an Indigenous way of life that had sustained itself for thousands of years and forced it into a commercial and industrial system whereby a nomadic way of life was no longer sustainable. The taking of northern resources to benefit of foreign corporate entities is something we are still reconciling with today. So this land, the Northwest Territories, must find a path forward, must be a leader in Canada, Mr. Speaker. I believe we must also take a strong political stance to push all other governments in Canada to do so. Northerners better than anyone should understand the right not to be controlled by those who don't understand the reality on the ground. Now, Mr. Speaker, why am I speaking about all this history? It is because it is of fundamental importance that we all understand how we got here in order to understand how to move forward. For us, those of us who love the North and wish to move forward as part of a united and prosperous Canada, we must first remedy the wrongs of the past. That is done through our current land claim process, in which Canada, through the Crown, returns the land to the Indigenous peoples to whom, in fact, it always belonged. It is my hope in time, Mr. Speaker, that all Indigenous people will be proud to call themselves Canadian and view themselves as part of this country and be able to comfortably walk with a foot in both worlds. Yet that is something I have no right to ask any person until their proper rights have been restored. You cannot use the withholding of rights as a bargaining chip in reconciliation, Mr. Speaker. The only way true Northern unity can occur is willingly and with a passion to progress forward together. Canada has often asked Indigenous people to join into this Canadian identity at an expense of their own. Mr. Speaker, reconciliation by force is a paradox. If one party remains unwilling or can't enter on their own terms, then it isn't reconciliation. It is assimilation at best. I want to emphasize that my goal and the small part I have to play is to build a strong North and a strong Canada that in turn builds strong Indigenous nations alongside of it. Mr. Speaker, this is the complexity of Northern identity that we all must reconcile. And the only way to do that is through trust, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I must also emphasize that we are together in the midst of a large social contract. As we settle land claims and self-government to give Indigenous governments more power to be free, more power to be independent, I also hope that through that independence will come unity. Reconciliating, yet now to the lawyer in me, Mr. Speaker, reconciliating with Canada comes with certain unalienable conditions, and this is the point where much of the tension will exist going forward. All Canadians, Indigenous or not, must respect the rights and responsibilities of our Charter. All Canadians must respect the law and the institutions we use to enforce them. Mr. Speaker, I emphasize that respect does not mean one cannot be frustrated by them or work to change them. I myself am frustrated by the rigidity, many of our institutions, and the resistance to change that they perpetuate. This is exactly why I stand here, Mr. Speaker, to bring about change from our institutions within.
I missed if there was a commitment at the end of that sentence as your head went down.
And so, if Canada is going to succeed and the North is going to prosper, and I am going to be proud to call this place home, I will spend the next 4 years, and in fact the rest of my life, building relationships so that everyone prospers and is truly welcomed on their own terms into this weird and beautiful creation called the Northwest Territories. Maybe we could change the name, but I'm not going to go there, Mr. Speaker. In this right, I would call upon this government, along with our Indigenous governments, to begin the push to once again enter into constitutional reform. For too long, this country has been tied up in disputes about federalism, with everything an argument about provincial or federal jurisdiction, a dispute that fails to address territorial or Indigenous rights. It is time for Canada to amend its constitution and rightfully place both Indigenous governments and territories in it. We are leaders in the North in this regard, and we must pressure Canada to do so. We are stronger united. We are stronger when we go to Ottawa with one united Northern voice, and we are stronger when we demand the world take meaningful action on climate change, which disproportionately affects us, with one voice. Mr. Speaker, the North is on a precipice. When that monarch dies on our money, of whom we all pledged allegiance to, what will her son or grandson unite the North? When we speak of the honor of the crown in negotiations, in courts, does anyone other than lawyers really buy into such a concept? If the Bathurst caribou disappears, is that caribou on our money something to be proud of, or just a testament to our collective failure? For far too long, the only reason Canada paid any attention to this place was one of resources. First furs, then gold, and now diamonds. But as our diamonds come to an end, and the NWT identity is not directly linked to resource extraction, some very pressing economic realities come into play. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, the NWT is a fake economy. Our economy is entirely dependent on federal funding. So when we live in a fake economy where it makes more economic sense to just stop fighting a losing battle and pack up and move down south, all of us must ensure we have a convincing answer as to why the rest of Canadian taxpayers are paying for all of this when there is no fur, gold, or diamonds for them in the deal. And the answer to this, Mr. Speaker, lies in the unalienable rights of all Canadians, the right to be provided in adequate services wherever they live in Canada. If economic efficiency were the only factor in nation building, we would all simply live in urban centers where the reality of economies of scale make providing services significantly cheaper. Yet Canada, in exerting control over these lands, historically has an obligation to both reconcile Indigenous rights to the land and support those who call this place home with the same level of service that a Canadian anywhere else gets, regardless of cost, Mr. Speaker.
This House stands adjourned until Monday, March 2nd.
This, Mr. Speaker, is the nature of public government. Given our small population, we may in fact spend millions of dollars providing services to a single person, but that is part of the Canadian social contract. We provide the same level of health care to all Canadians, no matter the cost. And Mr. Speaker, I am convinced that the federal government has forgotten that this is the heart of the social contract. We took on devolution as an interim measure to undo colonial control from Ottawa, but it is such power must inherently be used to undo colonialism at all levels, Mr. Speaker. The resources in our land are our savings for the future, and to only allow our continued existence to be contingent on the resources we send back to Ottawa is unjust. Canada needs to stop using the North and its symbols as a uniting cultural aspect without providing the people who live in the North an adequate level of government service. Mr. Speaker, I thank you all for listening to me. I hope this address can spur some larger conversations about what the NWT is and where it is going. Mr. Speaker, I also ask any who may disagree with me, please come and speak to me.
No.
First and foremost, it is all our jobs to listen more than we speak. Something that is a little ironic given that I just spoke for 20 minutes, Mr. Speaker. But I believe it goes without saying that the only way to reconcile and build a united and prosperous North is through healthy dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I will offer the member the whole staff of the Department of Justice to give him a briefing if he would like that for clarification.